Is there any hope for ending the political gridlock in Washington? Most Americans say they want their leaders to work together, and in the wake of the election, most of those leaders are at least saying they agree.
You elected us to focus on your jobs, not ours. And in that spirit, I've invited leaders of both parties to the White House next week so we can start to build consensus around the challenges that we can only solve together.
American people want us to work together. Republicans want us to work together. Democrats want us to work together.
Let's rise above the dysfunction and do the right thing together for our country.
So has the time for bipartisan compromise finally arrived? Former Democratic Senator George Mitchell of Maine has spent 3 decades working to bring people together. He was Senate Majority Leader during the presidencies of both Republican George H.W. Bush and Democrat Bill Clinton. He also helped broker the historic peace deal in Northern Ireland, and he served as President Obama's peace envoy to the Middle East. Senator Mitchell is a co-founder of the Bipartisan Policy Center and joins us from Chicago. Great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
There is a big difference between talk and action, and I wonder to what degree do you think this conciliatory tone that we're now hearing out of Washington days after the election is actually going to amount to something bipartisan in action?
I think it will amount to something in some areas, but obviously not in all. It's easy to make the general statements about wanting to get together, much tougher when you get into the details, because the public, while they do want cooperation, they generally tend to want it on their terms, and the terms are different. This is about an evenly divided country on many issues. But I do think that these leaders have the ability to reconcile the tensions that exist in our society on some issues and make some progress, and I hope that does occur.
Senator, there's been a lot of discussion recently about how the culture in the Senate seems to have changed. In your era, you know, Democrats and Republicans were often friends, went out to dinner at night or had drinks together. And I mean, do you believe the atmosphere has changed and in Washington and has made it much more difficult to essentially come together?
Yes, I do. It's always been tough. There never was a golden era when it was all sweetness and light. When I was there, I thought it was pretty rugged, although it's much more difficult now. On the day that I was elected Senate Majority Leader, I called Bob Dole, who was the Republican leader, and I went to see him. And I told him, I'm here to tell you how I intend to behave toward you, and I hope you'll behave the same way toward me. And I said very simple things. I won't surprise you. I won't try to embarrass you. I won't criticize you personally in public or in private. And he was delighted. We shook hands, and not once in the 6 years that I was the Senate Majority Leader and he was the Minority Leader did a harsh word ever pass between us, although we debated very vigorously and disagreed almost every day on issues. So it can be done, but it's tougher now. The vast infusion of money has had a corrupting influence in our country. It has, I think, severed the bond of trust between the public and politicians. Most people don't think that their elected officials are really representing them, but rather are more responsive to their contributors. And it's put the people in office and the candidates on a mad chase for money that really is never ending. I think that's a corrupting factor.
How do you forge? Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, how do you forge that compromise in a situation like that where some of the elected officials say either I was paid for by a particular group of people or I was voted for by a particular group of people who put me in office to do something very specific and ideologically very different from the alternative?
Well, I don't think the problem is, although it does exist, it's not widespread of actual corruption where someone is actually paid to do a vote. I think it's the perception by the public that exists that the political leaders are responsive to contributors. And of course, there is access that's more readily available to a big contributor than to an average constituent. But I think that the political leaders can do it. I think that they recognize that their highest obligation is to the country. And while they are members of a party and they have other obligations, obviously their own convictions, there's room in there to find outcomes that, while not 100% for anyone, represent a step forward for the country. I think that's the challenge. There has developed in this country in recent years an unfortunate rhetoric that compromise is a bad thing, that it represents the absence of conviction or strength, and that you're only really tough if you stand up and say no to any change whatsoever. That's not possible in a country of 310 million people as large and diverse as ours and as evenly divided as it is. So there has to be a recognition that national interest comes first. I think they can do it.
All right. We hope you're right. George Mitchell, thanks so much for being with us this morning.